All right, we'll cut out this part. Okay. Hey everyone, we're back with another Insight conversation as part of the ATL Education Expo here in the spring of 2021. And I'm really excited to chat with Chris Adams today. He's an attorney at Krevolin Horst and a former teacher himself and does a lot of education related law work. So Chris, thank you so much for being with us.
Happy to be here.
And it's going to be really exciting because you're actually the first attorney we've talked to who has a background in the classroom and that has stayed in the space. And I feel like that's a pathway a lot of teachers don't even think about when they go into the classroom. Most people think it's teaching and then I can be an administrator or bust. And so I definitely want to dig into that. But first, I'd love to hear, how did you get into education first? Like, where did you teach? What grade level? What was that like for you?
Yeah, so I taught in Atlanta Public Schools, and I was a fifth grade teacher. And I think I found out pretty quickly that I was really passionate about the education issues, but that teaching is really, really hard. And I wasn't necessarily that good at it, frankly. And so I think I sort of learned pretty quickly that there were other ways that I might, be able to contribute a little bit more and play more to my strengths. Dealing with frankly some of the adult issues surrounding education. So I went to law school, which is something I knew I might do anyways, but I did that, and then while I was in law school, I was pretty involved in education law policy type issues. So I knew I wanted to stay in that field. And then it took a few years after practicing to sort of come back to education.
Oh, okay.
So I had to spend a few years, doing things that weren't nearly as interesting in the law, general business litigation. But I found my way back to education, and then that's when I really started enjoying being a lawyer quite a bit more, frankly.
Awesome. Before we get into the kind of law you do within education, I know there's a lot of different facets that most of us don't even think about. I'd love to go back to when you were teaching fifth grade. First, I want to hear, what were you struggling with? What was really hard for you? I mean, all of us who were teachers, especially the first couple of years, are hard. What were the challenges for you?
Yeah, so I think, for me, it was like, the reason it was so hard is because you have to be good at several different things. So, you have to be good at the content. And for me, that was like, I could do that with a certain amount of prepreration, right?
Yeah, you knew fifth grade content. You could handle the fifth grade math.
Yeah, and you can't wing it. You still have to be prepared. So, you're teaching fifth grade math is not rocket science, but when you're teaching how to, multiply fractions, you have to think about what's a good way to explain this.
Right.
But I could do that with some preparation.
Sure.
But what was harder was certainly the classroom management and really specifically like the managing the personalities, which I don't think you can do well without a lot of practice. Surely some people are better. Surely some people are sort of, more cut out at the management part of it, but until you've encountered every situation where, the unexpected happens.
Right.
You just need to go through those situations several times to get good at it, I think. So that was definitely the hardest part.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, you hear that from every one of us who've taught. First thing you got to figure out is, how do you manage your classroom? And one of the themes that's come out of this conversation is that, teachers are really masters of controlling chaos. Like, every day in the classroom is chaos, in the sense that you've got 30 variables in there of students who you don't know what they're showing up with. You don't know what they just went through. You don't know what their mood is like, on top of them being kids in the first place. And so that's one of the reasons why, like, when the other parts of the school day start to infringe on teachers, it makes the job that much harder because they're already dealing with chaos. And so you mentioned that while you were in the classroom, you started, and maybe you had this happen before or during or after, but you started to notice other issues that were more like high level policy or adult related. You said, can you tell me more about that? Were there things that kind of stuck out while you were teaching that were like, I don't understand why this is the way it is?
Yeah. So, I'd say one thing is just the preparation, the different levels of preparation that students, students arrive at school with, right?
Sure.
So you've got, I mean, I was at a school that was a 90% free and reduced lunch school, but even within that population, you've got a huge disparity of some kids coming to school on day one relatively well prepared. They might have been to year 4 pre-K. They might have, really engaged, two parents. You've got other kids who have none of that.
Right.
And so just sort of the school is put in the position of meeting those kids where they are in that whole spectrum of situations. And I think that, that creates policy questions too, though. Should we be putting schools in that position? Should we be trying to do more before the kids even get to kindergarten,
Right.
to make it a little easier? So that was one issue, the early childhood education part of it. And then the other issue that I've been able to do some work on as a lawyer is the sort of diversity and socioeconomic integration issue, which is that I was teaching in a relatively racially isolated school.
Sure.
I went to a relatively racially isolated school, and in different directions, and that really struck me as like, why do we have to have these extremes? And it would be really nice if we could have schools that really more, and classrooms that really more reflected what the world looks like.
Right. So draw the line for me between, noticing that, and then, as you went into the into the law direction, which you already planned on doing, how, where's the law or the policy connection to something like that? And did you get into that while you were in law school or during your practice, anything like that?
Yeah. So it started in law school for me, in terms of some of the socioeconomic integration work. So I wrote my law school journal article on socioeconomic integration, and there was sort of a lot of research at the time on the benefits of it, and it's one of the things that social scientists sort of agree on pretty well, but that the law doesn't really do much to address.
Right.
And so I did some scholarship on it in law school, and then when I started practicing education law a decade ago or so, it was with charter schools, and fortunately there was sort of a group of charter schools here in Atlanta that was really focused on that issue, and eventually it's something that charter schools frankly sometimes get a bad rap for, but some of the schools in Atlanta were really trying to be proactive about taking on, and so you saw things like trying to create a weighted lottery to make it easier for low-income students to get into a charter school.
Yeah.
And along with recruitment and things like that, but you really had some really strong charter schools leading the way on that, and that and then you gotta help influence the law and things like that, and do some lobbying. Right. And then once Georgia fortunately was able to pass a law in 2015 that allowed for weighted lotteries, and now we've got about 6 schools in APS for doing it, APS and some of the surrounding districts. So that's been pretty rewarding to sort of see that happen in practice.
Did you get a chance to work on that at all, or is it just really like this is part of what you studied in law school or wrote about, and here you saw a policy that actually directly related to it?
Yeah, so I was able to work on that. Some of the schools that I work with, so Drew Charter School and Atlanta Neighborhood Charter School, and some of the other charter schools in APS were really some of the leaders on this issue. Wesley as well, and so they were the ones who asked for it, and then they've been the ones who have really been putting it into place. And I've been fortunate enough to work with some of them on sort of thinking that through from a policy perspective, as well as what they can and can't do as far as the law goes too.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I remember, I had the chance, to work on a charter school board before, and you learn some of these policies. Like I even as a teacher, I didn't know that every charter school is required to have a lottery like set up if they need it. And Georgia's still, you know, relatively young in its acceptance of charters, I guess you might say. But it sounds like you work directly with these schools, which I think is a good segue into, now as an attorney, what sort of roles do you play within the system? Do you represent schools? Do you represent districts? Do you represent parents? Like what are those different roles like for you?
Yeah, so for me, it's representing the schools, which means through their boards. So I'm most often working through the boards and the leadership. Um,
Mm,
so most often working with the boards on their oversight role, and then working with the school leaders on sort of the day-to-day stuff that comes up. So yeah, so both of those things, and then of course the parents and the teachers are stakeholders that
right.
we work with quite a bit as well too.
What are some of the issues that you might have to work with a principal or a school board, or a board of a school, I should say, on?
Yeah, so I mean there's sort of the proactive part, which would be designing the policies and um, accomplish the things that are consistent with the school's mission. So, if it's like the diversity policy we were just talking about, and that's sort of the
Right.
fun stuff. And then there's, of course, there's like a reactive part too. You've got things that happen in a school,
Yeah.
um, that you've just got to deal with, and that's sort of often, you're playing defense. The unexpected
Right.
happens. It's not always good. Um, you got unexpected disciplinary situations happen with kids, or
Sure.
employment situations happen with an employee does something wrong, and so you've got to figure out what to do about that. But they're both equally important.
Yeah, I'm curious, like now that you sit on this side of the table and from a legal lens, has your experience as an attorney made you look at your teaching experience any differently? Because one of the things that comes up a lot is like a lot of schools get into this sort of tradition of being more compliance driven than other things because there's so many legal ramifications because you're dealing with people's families, children, state law, federal law, local law. So I'm curious, like now you've been in the legal side of this space, have you looked at the teaching profession or your own experiences any differently?
Yeah, it's a great question, and yes, I mean, I'm wearing a hat now, usually of trying to make sure that this school is not is compliant and is not sort of taking on a bunch of risks, things like that. But there's another side to it, which is you also want your schools, and you want uh, your leaders and your teachers. You want them to you don't want them to be afraid. You want them to be able to take some risks as well. And
Right.
so, and I'm representing charter schools whose frankly, mission is to be innovative. And
Right.
so it's sort of a balance of, what are the risks that are worth it versus
Mm,
what are the risks that are not. And so, allowing an employee to go do something that might put children at risk, that's not a risk worth taking.
sure.
But allowing the school to do something a little differently that isn't going to put student at risk, but is just something that hasn't been done before, and might have real benefit. Those are the risks we want to encourage schools to take. So it's
Right.
kind of how deciding sort of which one of those worlds you're in. But yeah, I definitely do. I definitely am looking at it through a different lens now. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't. I feel like a school is like a liability nightmare most of the time, if you're really looking at it. But I'm curious, since you've done a lot of work with charter schools, a lot of teachers, along with the general public, don't necessarily understand what a charter school actually is and what it means to be a charter school. There's some folks who, and charter schools get a lot of hate in political worlds for privatizing education. All these political sound bites get thrown around that aren't actually accurate. So I would love for you to just give us like a sense of big picture, highest level. what is a charter school, and then what are some of the things that within policy they're allowed to play with versus a traditional school?
Yeah, so it's a good question. There's a lot of misunderstanding. A charter school is a public school, first
Right,
of all.
right,
And the reason that it's different from a traditional school is that it it answers to a charter. It has a contract, and
mm,
so that's basically a two-way street. The school has a contract with its authorizer, which is usually the school district,
right,
and basically it has to fulfill certain things, and in exchange it gets to stay open, usually for 5 years. And that's very different than a traditional school, which the presumption is that it's going to keep staying open until
right,
maybe it doesn't have enough enrollment or it gets closed for some reason.
right.
But
Yeah.
so it means that it's sort of always it's only authorizing, it's only staying open as long as it's achieving, some level of success.
Right.
Um, Now you mentioned the privatization and that kind of thing. When it comes to the management of the school, um, that's where some schools choose to be managed by private organizations,
Sure.
but it's actually it's a minority of schools. It's definitely, most schools are managed by they're always overseen by a nonprofit board, and most are managed by a nonprofit corporation. So these sort of, you know private education, privatization stories are sort of a little bit overdone.
Oh yeah. I mean, and to your point, what you mentioned in the beginning, if you want to start a charter school, you have to come up with what's your model, and then it has to be authorized by some public entity, whether it's the local school board or now the state board. And so there's always that public oversight arm in addition to the board itself of the actual school, right? So it's not like we're just like pushing all the kids into a private company's house and then leaving them by themselves, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, traditional schools buy their pencils from a private company,
Right.
and outsource all kinds of other functions.
Yeah.
Charter schools, one function that some of them outsource is some of the management of the school to varying levels.
Right.
But most of them don't even do that.
So what are some of the things that you see, because every charter claims they have a unique model, right? They're doing it so differently than everybody else. But I'm curious, like, what are the most common things that you see charters when they apply for their charter? One of the things they have to do is get waivers for certain, restrictions, certain policies that typically govern a traditional school. So I'm curious, what are the most common things you see new charters when they start up? They usually want a waiver for this and a waiver for this. These are things they play with most often. Are there trends that you see across them?
Yeah, so I'd say some of the common ones would be like length of the school day, or length of the school year.
Mhm.
So like a pretty simple innovation is, you know, kids do better when they're in the classroom more.
Right, right,
So let's have a longer school day. Let's have a longer school year.
yeah,
That sounds pretty simple, but you need a waiver to do that.
right,
Otherwise, you would have to follow the school calendar that a district uses.
right. Are there what other ones have you seen that stick out in your head?
Yeah, so you can also waive things like the seat time requirements or the teacher salary schedules.
Mm,
I think one of the ones that is an especially important innovation is, there's schools out there that want to have um, fewer kids for each teacher, a
right,
lower student teacher ratio, and so that means they're going to need all kinds of waivers around other type of administrative positions they might need to have, other kinds of specials that they might offer.
right,
But if a school wants to make that trade-off and say, let's just have 6 or 7 kids to a teacher, and we know we're going to sacrifice elsewhere, but we think it's important to try this. That's a
right,
really important innovation, and we all benefit from knowing if that works. So that kind of that a waiver to achieve that kind of innovation is pretty important, and it's something that you couldn't do without a charter school that is allowed to have those kind of waivers.
Right. Yeah. I think this is a really important point because like we focus so much on what things we have to waive for charter schools, but on the flip side, thinking about it now, it's like, well, if a traditional school, traditional, in quotes here, was to try to do smaller class sizes or a longer school day, they couldn't do it, right? They're not allowed to do that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, all we're doing is saying, we understand that maybe not all schools should be sort of put in this box, and we should allow a little bit of experimentation, a little bit of innovation. We'll give you a little more rope to try those things,
Right.
as long as you can sort of meet certain thresholds.
Yeah, and it's a tough balance. I think the reason I raised that point is because I think people don't appreciate how many restrictions are placed on a traditional school and their leadership team, right? Like and this is what's come up across all these conversations we've been doing. The theme has always been that it's the structures and not the people that are the problem with the system, in the sense that the structures constrain everyone from trying new stuff. Like if I stayed in the classroom and became a principal of the high school I taught at, I still would be constrained. Like I couldn't experiment with a lot of these things, right? And so, it's interesting. I'm curious, knowing that and knowing the ins and outs of that, like, and also seeing how much, for lack of a better term, how much shit people give public school systems. Like, do you think that's fair? It's like, we're just not giving school leaders enough leeway to try stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because you understand the temptation to sort of make sure everybody adheres to a certain set of standards and to a certain set of best practices. So I get the temptation, but at the same time, it's we've got some brilliant folks out there, really with some great ideas in education, and so we need to allow a platform for them to try things out for the benefit of everyone.
Right.
So when you do it, you understand that not all schools are going to make it, and that's sort of the other part of it, is that you do have to close some schools that don't work, and it's important to look at that as that's not a failure, that's sort of a success when you've closed a school that wasn't making it. It's sort of an acknowledgement that that's the way the system's supposed to work. It may be for every 2 schools you close, you get that brilliant one that then you're going to replicate and learn from. So
I think that's one of the things that is so hard about trying new things in education, right? Because nobody wants their child to be the guinea pig. And, but at the same time, we can't try anything on simulations or robots or anything. So like, there's got to be testing out there. And, people always throw around, I think it's like 50% of charter schools fail or something like that. But again, to your point, it's like, that shouldn't be that crazy to us, because that means that either they're poorly run and they should be shut down, or they're trying something and their idea didn't work, but at least they tried it, and we now know that it did or did not work, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you're right. We don't want it to be a free for all. It's not just a free market. Like, it needs to be regulated, and we do need to do what we can on the front end to try and make sure that we have the best pool of schools that are in our portfolio. And so the authorizer has a really important role in that, to make sure that there's as much quality control as you could have on the front end, that this board seems like one that can really oversee a school. School is set up financially in a position that we think they can succeed, and we're not putting them in a position where they're going to fail. So that is a really important function on the front end and throughout. But even with taking all those measures, there's still going to be some that succeed and some that fail.
Right. Yeah, that's inevitable. You made me think of one more thing I wanted to ask you about, and I'm blanking on it. Give me 1 second. It'll come to me. Uh, Shit. I can't remember, but we'll come back to it if I remember. So to sort of wrap this up, put a bow on it, you've seen from the policy angle so much of education and schools and what's been working, what's not. I remember my question now, and I'm going to ask that instead of going to my final question. You mentioned that, and this is the idea behind charters, right? At least the initial idea was, all right, here's a charter, let them try something new. And then the second piece that you mentioned, and that I always talk about too, is so that we can learn from what they're doing, right? I'm curious from where you sit, interacting with districts and charter schools a lot. And do you feel like that sharing of best practices happens often or even intentionally enough? Or do you feel like that's a piece that we could be doing better?
Well, I'd say, I mean, we could definitely be doing it better. There's no question about it. Um, but the yeah, but the sharing does happen, and sometimes it's very intentional. Um, but other times it's more, organic. You'll see, so for example, you'll see a school that succeeds and on whatever metrics, and then usually a couple things will happen. One is they'll probably get to start another school, right?
Mhm.
So you've sort of like organically proliferated that idea, and
Sure.
then also other schools will see what they did. It's not going to stay a secret, and they'll see what they'll do, and they'll try and replicate it. They'll try and borrow from it, and that's a good thing. Now, what we don't see maybe as much of that we'd want is sort of that traditional school charter school partnership. But you do see that as well. I think it maybe hasn't happened as quickly as the original founders of charter schools had hoped for,
Right.
but
Sure.
but but it but it but it, but it does happen.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder what a world would look like where it's more intentionally done. But you're absolutely right in that it happens. Like even thinking about your role as an attorney who helps craft these policies and procedures and brings these schools to life. I mean, I remember conversations when you were to work with our board and you constantly reference, well, hey, this really worked for this school over here. This really worked for this school over here. And so even that more organic sharing happens because of the folks providing professional services like yourself who just you naturally are going to say, oh, this is what else has worked around me. So yeah, I mean, that sense, it definitely occurs. I just wish part of me personally, this is me personally speaking, I just wish it was more intentional. I wish we were like, hey, here's what Kip and Drew and Condesi and all those folks, like, here's what they learned over the last 2 years. Here's their like best practice top 5 or something. And you pass that around. I think we overcomplicate it sometimes, but something as small as that could be really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a great point.
So the last question we ask everybody who comes and does these insight conversations is, what do you think education should look like by the year 2050? So about 30 years out. And like good teachers, I'm trying to get people to backwards plan here. And so think about what do we think it should look like? And then, what do we, based off that, what do we think we should be doing today? And so in your head, you think about 2050, what do you think education should look like?
How to end with a really easy question, Ian.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
my specialty.
I mean, well, it's especially um, sort of interesting question right now because the answer's probably changed quite a bit from if you had asked it 14 months ago, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Um, 30 years now. I mean, that seems like we've just gone on fast forward in the last year, and
Right.
so we're probably accelerating to whatever it is so much faster now.
Yeah,
um I don't know what it will look like, but what I hope it contains
yeah.
are some degree of I mean, really three things. So I think some degree of equality, more equality, more focus, and more relevance. So what I mean by that is, I mean, the pandemic is obviously, and just sort of, our social awareness has really shined a light on the inequities in our system.
Right.
And so I'm hopeful that sometimes things have to get worse to get better. And so that focus will really bring about more of a discussion about the equity piece of it. I mean, it was ridiculous already that we
Right.
had kids going to a school based on, their zip code and what, their gerrymandered, property district was in, their own school was
Right.
in. It was
Right.
already crazy before, and it's even crazier now if we're in things like when we've seen, virtual and hybrid school and all these sort of other options we have.
Yeah.
So my hope is that we'll find a better way to give kids more equitable opportunities. And then, we also need to focus a lot more on just sort of how important it is. I mean, everybody who's been at home with their kids and has seen like the important role of not having kids in school, something that we've taken for granted for so long,
Yeah.
right? I think we've shined a light on just sort of how important school and teachers really are in our lives, not just for the education of our kids, but for the functioning of our society. So,
Right.
I'm sort of hopeful that we're willing to make investments that maybe we weren't willing to make just a year ago. And then finally, making it relevant. So, we had sort of, there's probably been a disconnect for a while between what kids learn in the classroom and what we hope their jobs will be.
Right.
But, that's sort of, I think that might also get some additional attention from the pandemic as well. When we think about, okay, we sort of start to rethink, well, what do kids, they got a limited amount of time in the day. What do we really need to be teaching them and why?
Yeah.
What are we trying to prepare them for? What kind of jobs are actually out there? What kind of jobs are, vulnerable in times like this? What should we be steering them towards? I'm sure we'll have a new focus. So,
Yeah.
you
No, I like that. No, that's absolutely, it's funny because to your second point, like the pandemic forced every parent pretty much to be back inside the classroom with their student, essentially. Like they forced them to, if they were able to stay at home and supply them with what they need to be connected to school virtually, then all of a sudden, like, 'cause I heard this, my three brothers all have kids between the ages of 1 and 5. And so, they're in early childcare stuff, but they would tell me about, like, they literally have to sit there and listen and watch their child to make sure they're engaged. But by doing that, they're also, for the first time in a long time, probably hearing what a lesson actually is like, hearing and seeing their teacher do work, and then seeing how those things change and progress over the course of a year. And so to your point, it's like, it just shoved this experience that all of us kind of push aside. It's like, oh, all right, I want to send my kid off. They'll come back. Like, I need to trust the system. And now it's like, well, a ton of people just saw inside the classroom. And now what kind of impression does that leave? And what do we do after this is over? I personally am not terribly confident that a lot of stuff's going to change once we kind of go back. I think people are trying to just snap back to what it's been. But to your point, I think if nothing else, hopefully this motivates people to be less of a passive observer of their child's education and more engaged in like what that's like. Because I think that's one of the challenges around some of these changes that we don't see. It's sort of like my child goes off, and once they're out of the system, like, I'm done with it. In reality, like, this is the lifeblood of our communities, right? It's producing the next generation of leaders, workers, buyers, all those things. So hopefully the pandemic has made people appreciate that more.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There's nothing like having the classroom, beamed into your kitchen each morning.
Right. Yeah, my brother told me, he's like, yeah, today I learned the letter B with my daughter. I was like, oh, it's good. It's good. It's a good refresher for him. Well, this has been awesome, Chris. I really appreciate you taking the time. Again, this is Chris Adams from Krevolin Horst, a local law firm that does a lot in education with systems and schools, and a former teacher himself. So we appreciate you sharing your insights as part of this conversation for the ATL Education Expo. And thank you for being with us.